Welcome to this video on hermeneutics. I'm Andrew Chapman. I'm a professor of philosophy, and I'll be your guide. In addition to this video, I've also created a handout covering the content of the video. The link to the handout is available in the video description. It may be helpful to have this handout in front of you as you watch the video. And now on to hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the art and science of interpretation, primarily concerned with uncovering the meanings of texts, language, and symbols. Its name derives from the Greek verb hermeneuein, meaning to interpret or to translate, indicating its foundational role in facilitating understanding across different contexts. Initially developed in settings such as biblical exegesis and legal commentary, hermeneutics has since expanded into a pervasive theoretical framework that shapes inquiry across the humanities and social sciences. It addresses how interpreters engage with written works or cultural artifacts by examining the dynamic interaction between a text's original milieu and the reader's own historical and cultural positioning. By emphasizing that no interpretation is purely detached from context, hermeneutics underscores the complexity and fluidity inherent in understanding human expressions, whether those expressions are literary, philosophical, legal, or theological. Hermeneutics traces its lineage back to antiquity, when interpreters grappled with ambiguous or symbolically rich texts that demanded systematic clarification. In the ancient Greek world, scholars confronted complex religious, poetic, and legal material, illustrating the long-standing need for interpretive strategies. During the Middle Ages, Christian theologians elaborated methods of scriptural exegesis, forging new ways of reconciling sacred texts with doctrinal and philosophical developments. These early efforts established a tradition of rigorous textual analysis, but it was not until the modern era that hermeneutics evolved into a comprehensive philosophical pursuit. A decisive shift occurred in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, particularly through the work of Friedrich Schleiermacher, who revolutionized biblical and classical scholarship by proposing that understanding a text requires attending to both its linguistic construction and the psychological context of its author. In Schleiermacher's view, the interpreter must undertake a simultaneous study of grammar and historical background while striving to reconstruct the subjective intentions behind a written work. This formed the foundation of a more general interpretive method. Rather than limiting interpretation to the theological sphere, Schleiermacher opened the door for hermeneutics to shape discussions of literature, history, and culture. Wilhelm Dilthey extended these insights by arguing that the human sciences, in German Geisteswissenschaften, need a distinctive mode of inquiry that differs from the empirical procedures of the natural sciences. Dilthey believed that understanding lived experience is pivotal to capturing the essence of historical and cultural phenomena, thus establishing hermeneutics as a methodological cornerstone for disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, psychology, and historiography. In the 20th century, Martin Heidegger recast hermeneutics as an existential inquiry, proposing that human beings are always engaged in interpretive acts shaped by their own historical and social situatedness. Hans-Georg further refined this view in his seminal work Truth and Method, arguing that understanding emerges through a dialogical fusion of horizons in which the interpreter's contemporary perspective meets the text's historical horizon. This shift positioned hermeneutics as a philosophy of understanding rather than a mere set of interpretive rules, and made it central to debates about the nature of truth, objectivity, and tradition in the modern world. Friedrich Schleiermacher laid the groundwork for modern hermeneutics by insisting that interpreters must not only analyze the structural elements of a text, but also engage empathetically with its author's mental world. He saw grammatical analysis and psychological interpretation as two complementary sides of the same coin. Wilhelm Dilthey advanced hermeneutics beyond textual analysis to become a universal methodology for understanding human expressions across time, particularly stressing that the meaning of social and historical events can only be grasped through a conscientious, historically aware perspective. Martin Heidegger brought hermeneutics into the realm of existential ontology, arguing that interpretation is not a task humans perform occasionally, but an ever-present condition of being in the world. Heidegger posited that our entire mode of existence is interpretive because we continually navigate the meanings of our surroundings. Hans-Georg built upon this existential base, emphasizing that any interpretation is shaped by the prejudices, traditions, and linguistic framework of the interpreter, who in turn is influenced by the historical and cultural context of the text. Gadamer's notion of the fusion of horizons suggests that meaning is co-created by the interplay of past and present, so that understanding is always an event, a dynamic happening, rather than a static act of decoding. Hermeneutics rests on several interconnected principles that illuminate the interpretive process. One central tenet is the hermeneutic circle, which affirms that the whole of a text can only be understood through its parts, just as the parts gain significance by referencing the whole. This iterative loop compels interpreters to move back and forth between detail and context, refining their understanding at each pass. Hermeneutics also foregrounds the role of historical consciousness, recognizing that both the text and the interpreter exist in a specific historical moment. As language and conceptual frameworks shift across time, interpretation likewise changes. Instead of seeking to neutralize these shifts, hermeneutics calls for an explicit awareness of them. Another guiding principle is the idea that prejudgments or preconceptions are not obstacles to be eliminated, but necessary starting points that can guide one toward understanding. Gadamer emphasized that an authentic engagement with a text involves a willingness to question one's own biases in light of what the text says, thus enabling a transformative process. Accordingly, hermeneutics is dialogical in essence, unfolding as a conversation between the interpreter and the text. This conversation does not yield meaning as a fixed object, but rather allows it to emerge through reciprocal influence between one's historical standpoint and the text's own horizon of significance. Although often discussed in philosophical contexts, hermeneutics exerts a far-reaching influence that extends into everyday interpretive activities. In literary studies, hermeneutic approaches enable scholars to unravel the complexities of poetry, fiction, and drama by examining how textual elements reflect the author's era, cultural background, and stylistic innovations, while also taking into account the reader's shifting perspectives over time. In the legal realm, hermeneutic principles underpin statutory and constitutional interpretation, guiding judges and lawyers through the complex task of applying legal texts to real-world scenarios. Religious studies and theology depend on hermeneutic methods to discern the layered meanings of sacred scriptures and to explore how these meanings evolve in different historical and congregational contexts. In qualitative research within the social sciences, hermeneutics provides a robust framework for interpreting interviews, ethnographic data, and cultural practices. By stressing the necessity of empathetic engagement and historical awareness, it helps researchers avoid imposing their own assumptions on communities under study. As a result, hermeneutics fosters a deeper grasp of how social actors construct, communicate, and negotiate meaning within their everyday lives. Even in contemporary fields like technology design and human-computer interaction, hermeneutic insights reveal how user experiences are profoundly shaped by interpretive factors such as cultural norms, language usage, and the interactive affordances of software interfaces. Hermeneutics has consistently sparked intense debates over questions of objectivity, authorial intent, and the limits of interpretive pluralism. One key tension concerns whether it is possible to access a text's original or true meaning. Traditional approaches tended to prioritize uncovering the author's intended message, but philosophers like Gadamer argue that meaning is not strictly determined by authorial intent, and that new contexts elicit new understandings. This raises the issue of whether interpretations can remain valid if they depart significantly from what the author might have envisioned. Another debate focuses on the role of prejudice or bias in interpretation. Critics worry that acknowledging bias risks sliding into a relativistic stance, where any reading can be justified by reference to the interpreter's horizon. Hermeneutic theorists respond that recognizing one's prejudices is precisely what makes it possible to refine and evaluate them. Through self-critical engagement and dialogue with the text, interpreters avoid the pitfalls of rigid subjectivism while still admitting that a wholly neutral stance is unattainable. These discussions probe the balance between a responsible, text-sensitive reading and the acceptance that interpreters inevitably bring their own history, language, and worldview to bear. Hermeneutics has come under criticism from several quarters. Logical positivists and certain analytic philosophers have dismissed hermeneutics as overly subjective, lacking in verifiable methods for distinguishing more accurate readings from less accurate ones. Postmodern critics, meanwhile, sometimes view hermeneutics as insufficiently radical, arguing that it continues to assume a possibility of coherent meaning, even as it concedes that meaning is shaped by historical context. Critics also accuse hermeneutics of glossing over power imbalances in interpretive processes, asserting that the Gadamerian fusion of horizons may obscure how political or ideological forces constrain what counts as a valid interpretation. Advocates of hermeneutics rebut these criticisms by pointing out that the tradition has evolved considerably, and that thinkers like Gadamer acknowledged the role of dialogue in challenging entrenched prejudices, including those rooted in politics or ideology. They argue that hermeneutics does not deny the existence of more or less persuasive interpretations. Rather, it insists that criteria for persuasiveness arise from historically informed conversation. The refusal to claim a single, ultimate interpretation does not automatically entail that all readings are equal. Scholars further underscore that hermeneutics fosters accountability by requiring interpreters to articulate their assumptions, examine them in the light of textual evidence, and remain open to critical feedback. As a broad philosophy of understanding, hermeneutics informs a striking array of disciplines and professional practices. Historians apply hermeneutic methods to interpret archival documents, seeking to reconstruct events within their cultural and ideological settings, rather than assuming a straightforward chronological narrative. Anthropologists rely on hermeneutics to grasp how cultural insiders themselves interpret their own practices, ceremonies, and beliefs, employing deep immersion and dialogue to move beyond superficial judgments. In psychology, especially in existential or humanistic strands, hermeneutics influences therapeutic techniques that focus on interpreting clients' life narratives and subjective experiences. Even in design and engineering fields, hermeneutics prompts reflection on how users interpret artifacts, instructions, or symbols, and on how designers can better anticipate these interpretive processes. Hermeneutics remains a flourishing and evolving field that has adapted to contemporary concerns. It interacts with post-structuralist, deconstructive, and critical theories, refining its approaches to language, power, and ideology. Scholars continue to grapple with how digital texts, multimedia platforms, and global cultural exchanges are reshaping interpretive practices. The once stark division between traditional hermeneutics, with its emphasis on historical rootedness, and more avant-garde textual strategies, has diminished as researchers recognize that all forms of scholarship inevitably engage in interpretive acts. Hermeneutics today is also employed to discuss ethical questions in biomedical research, the significance of narratives in climate change debates, and how technology filters our understanding of current events. In short, hermeneutics stands as both an ancient and a highly contemporary discipline that underscores the interconnectedness of human language, history, and interpretation. The influence of hermeneutics is evident in how the humanities and social sciences approach textual and cultural study. By emphasizing that meaning is always co-constructed through the interplay of author, text, and reader, hermeneutics helped overturn older notions of a text possessing a single, fixed message. It encouraged scholars to reflect on their own roles and biases in shaping interpretations, leading to more self-conscious and reflexive strategies and methods. Through figures like Gadamer, hermeneutics championed dialogue as a path toward mutual understanding, a principle that can be applied not just in scholarly work, but also in cross-cultural interactions and conflict resolution initiatives. Hermeneutics continues to underscore how interpretation can act as a bridge between disparate horizons. Its legacy is one of intellectual hospitality, inviting interpreters to enter worlds different from their own, yet also calling them to reveal and critique their own assumptions in that encounter. This open-ended and dialogical stance, while it may vex those seeking definitive certainty, has empowered countless thinkers to imagine new possibilities for understanding texts, traditions, and ultimately, one another. In conclusion, hermeneutics, which emerged as a formal discipline for interpreting religious and legal texts, has blossomed into a far-reaching philosophical framework that addresses how humans make sense of every dimension of their communicative world. By acknowledging the inseparability of the text's historical context and the interpreter's own cultural horizon, hermeneutics propels an ongoing conversation between past and present, self and other. It does not provide a foolproof formula for objective truth, but rather insists that genuine understanding depends on openness, reflection, and the willingness to engage in what Gadamer termed a fusion of horizons. This approach has reshaped disciplines from literary criticism to anthropology, from theology to design, championing an ethos of dialogue that is as vital in our diverse, information-saturated age as it has ever been. Through hermeneutics, scholars and practitioners alike learn to treat texts and cultural expressions as living conversations, woven into the fabric of historical context, yet continually reinterpreted through the lens of ongoing human experience.